is called When I Was King Little Tiger. In January of 2009, I was a mess. The relationship I'd been in for several years ended on New Year's Day, and I had to move back in with my parents because I didn't have a grandmother. Even though I had a bachelor's degree in fine arts from the University of Calgary, I did not have gainful employment. I weighed over 340 pounds and for some reason was depressed. I needed a change. I wanted to travel, but I didn't know where I wanted to go. But I had this desperate longing to get out of Calgary. I told my friends about my desire to leave, and it was Neil that asked if I was interested in working abroad. He offered to email a contact in Qingzhou, Shandong Province, China. A few years prior, Neil had taught at the Weifang Jiaoyu Shuiyuan Laoshao. It's a real place, Google it. And it means Weifang Vocational College, Old Campus. His contact's English name was Alexandra, but in all honesty, I thought nothing would come of it. A week went by, and I received an email from her. She said all she really needed was a copy of my bachelor's degree, and she would send me a letter I could take to the Chinese consulate where they would prepare my visa. Even at the time, in the back of my mind, I never thought I would actually be going to China. It seemed too far away, too outside my comfort zone, too foreign, too different, and too strange. It was only a matter of weeks before I picked up my visa. I was scheduled to arrive at the end of August and would stay for one full school year. When I landed in Weifang, it was late evening. I was picked up at the airport by Alexandra and a driver from the college. He drove us the 2 hours to the small city of Qingzhou, small by China standards with less than 1 million people. I've never felt more isolated. I was the only non-Asian person for miles. I couldn't speak the language, and I didn't understand the culture. It was dark by the time we reached my small apartment that I would call home for the next 11 months. I remember the huge metal gate to the old campus, which was built in 1881, sliding open for the first time in the dark night and feeling like a prisoner who'd been kidnapped. It was terrifying and exhilarating. There was a security guard at the gate. He would sleep in the small house next to the gate, and if you wanted to get in after 2 a.m., which I did on a few occasions, the only way was to bang on the gate and wake him up. Alexandra gave me the key to my apartment, and I went in for the first time. The floor was concrete. The walls were made of thin, cracked plaster, everything was covered in dust, and there were massive cobwebs in the corners. The shower had been retrofitted into the bathroom, which was more like an outhouse, so I had to fill the shower and plug it in every morning if I wanted to get hot water. Apparently, this is quite a common setup in China. There was a refrigerator in the kitchen, but the stove was actually just a propane tank connected to a burner, which I never ended up using anyway. The bed was made of plywood with a thin sheet. I only found out later, after I come home, that other teachers after me had refused to stay in the apartment. For some reason, the thought of turning up my nose at the place clashed with my Canadian sensibilities. The next morning, Alexandra came to my house, and we took the 15-minute bus ride to the new campus, which was only 2 years old. Everything was smooth, white stone. It was built on the side of Yunmen Mountain. The bus dropped us off at the bottom of the mountain, and we had to hike up halfway to reach the first floor of the school. My office was on the 5th floor, so I had to go up a few more set of stairs because there was no elevator. This was not an easy task for someone of my size. I was assigned over 300 students and was to teach 11 classes per week. There was no curriculum, no textbook, and I had no formal training in English language instruction. I was an imposter. Yes, I had taught theater to young kids from across Alberta, but those were plays based on stories by Robert Munch. This was much different. These were adults, and I was sure they could tell I was a fraud. Also, I would be teaching my first class in 2 days. So, I started designing my own curriculum. Whatever they wanted to talk about, I encouraged them to talk about. I kept telling them that I didn't really care what we discussed as long as they spoke in English. For many, this was a completely foreign concept. They were used to the teacher standing at the front of the class and dictating the lesson while they took notes. The idea that they could talk back to me, disagree with me, or get into a debate was completely heretical. In Chinese culture, at least, fair skin is perceived as more exotic than darker skin, and I became a bit of a celebrity around campus. Everyone that wasn't one of my students stared at me. The braver ones said timid hellos as I walked past them in the hallway. Some of my students already had English names, but most wanted me to give them one, so I obliged. I generated a list of names for them to pick from. But I thought it was only fair that my students give me a Chinese name. So, one of my students, her English name was Winter, she suggested Wang Xiaohe. which means king little tiger. The other students thought this was hilarious because I am so big, but also because apparently I am quite childlike. I'm pretty sure they meant immature. I would eventually come to appreciate the forthright nature of Chinese culture. Initially, I relied on Alexandra for pretty much everything. I needed her to take me shopping. It was her responsibility to make sure I was paid on time, and she was the liaison between me and the university. So you can imagine my shock when after a few months, she said she would be leaving. She'd been offered a temporary position in a school near Russia, where she would be teaching Mandarin to Russian students, sort of an exchange program. So out of necessity, I learned the basics required for shopping. Numbers or simple phrases such as 我不会说中文, which means I don't know how to speak Chinese. Of course, I also relied on my students to help me accomplish basic tasks, such as opening a bank account. Many of them obliged because they wanted to practice their English. Sometimes a big group of them would insist on taking me out for lunch or dinner. Eating and visiting with my students became very important. They were, after all, the only people I could have a conversation with. Then one night in mid-November, I was lying on my couch in my slightly less filthy but still drafty apartment. It was a cold night, and I fell asleep watching something on my laptop. When I woke up, I twisted to get off the couch and tweaked my back. Any slight movement was agony. I grabbed my laptop and contacted one of my students with QQ. QQ is a form of Chinese social media. My student, whose English name was Bridget, helped me to the hospital, which was only across the street. It should have taken me 5 minutes to get there, but I was in so much pain that it took 45. I had pulled a muscle in my lower back, and now I was trapped in bed until I recovered. Bridget came to visit me every day that week. She brought me food, medicine, heat pack. When I returned to my teaching duties, I was slower, and it took me longer to climb the 5 flights of stairs, but I managed, and eventually I healed. I had a few things on my list to see while I was in China, and I wouldn't have been able to see them without Bridget's help. During the Chinese holiday, they don't take Christmas off, so it's pretty much January 1st to Chinese New Year. I was able to walk on the Great Wall and visit the Terracotta Army in Xi'an. But after that, Bridget had to stay in Qingdao for the remainder of the holiday, which is where her family lives. Qingdao is about 3 hours away from Qingzhou. So now I'm back in my little apartment in Qingzhou. My Chinese is getting better, but I'm not fluent. Alexandra's gone, Bridget is gone, all of my students are gone. At times, that little room felt like a prison. I could come and go wherever I wanted, but when you have nowhere to go and no one to see, what's the point? Then there were rolling blackouts, when I would lose my electricity periodically for a few hours, sometimes a whole evening. Also, the temperature had dropped and kept dropping, and then the snow came. And there was one night when I was lying there and my breath was freezing on the blanket because my small space heater had broken, and I was actually really scared and angry and a little bitter. Traveling sucks. I hate China. Why did I leave Canada? I can't access Facebook or connect with my friends. And then I listened to myself, and something changed. I remembered I had jumped into the deep end, and this was the deepest end of the pool. I had no one, and it was time to sink or swim. It was about 5 weeks before the start of a second semester, and if I could just make it until then, things would improve. So I woke up the next morning after that chilly night, and I started walking. I walked all around Qingzhou. I crisscrossed every path of that ancient little city and made sure I was stared at by every local. I walked for 3 hours every morning for the next month, and I became excited about being in China again. I remembered what a privilege it was for me to be there, even though everything was a struggle. In the afternoon, I would return home and write for a few hours or study my Chinese. It was in these few short weeks that I completed the play that would get me into university for my master's, and that's also when I lost the bulk of the weight that I brought with me from Canada. When the second semester started, I told my students I wanted to try the local cuisine. One student said she would take me to a restaurant on the outskirts of town. We took a taxi to this tiny little shack out in the middle of nowhere. It was made from corrugated metal, and there were chickens in a coop on the way up to the opening. We went inside, and there was a small private room with 5 local businessmen sitting around a table. I'm fairly certain my student was having an affair with one of them. That's more of a hunch. Anyway, she introduced me as a foreign English teacher from Canada, and they offered to buy me all the food and drink I could handle. They set down a bottle of baijiu, which is known in some circles as the white devil. Baijiu is a clear liquor, and it's usually about 80 to 100 proof. Then, a large plate of locusts was set down in front of me. I know, right? They were roughly 2 inches long, big wings, long dark legs, dark brown eyes, and they'd been smoked. My face must have gone pale immediately, and I looked at the men around the table. Again, I didn't want to be rude and tell them that my stomach had turned at the sight of these giant grasshoppers, but by the same token, I had come to China to try new things. This was the whole point. If I didn't eat these, then I really would be a fraud. I had to. One of the men saw my reluctance and told my student to tell me that I might be allergic and I should probably not eat them. I told her to tell him I was very grateful and I wanted to try them, it's just that we don't have food like this in Canada. The table spun around and everyone took some locusts, except for my student. She actually refused to eat them at all. By the time they had come back to me, I had taken enough sips of baijiu that my courage was up. So I grabbed one with my chopsticks and popped the whole thing into my mouth. It had a smoky flavor and a crunchy texture. The wings and legs stuck in my throat. I took another sip of baijiu just to get it down. Wu jiao wang xiao hua, I boasted. I am King Little Tiger. The men clapped. My student laughed. Now here's where I got cocky. I had another and another. Each time I had to take a sip of baijiu to get it down. I don't really remember too much after that. I know I got back to the old campus after 2 a.m. and had to wake up the guard to let me in. I walked in the door and all I could think about was the last locust I ate. I made the mistake of biting that one in half. Somehow, the image of the inside of the locust and knowing that it was in my stomach mixed with the baijiu was enough to bring everything back up. Wings and legs sticking in my throat again. That's what I get for trying new things, I suppose. Near the end of the second semester, I conducted final interviews with each of my students. One of my rare male students, whose English name was Aaron, decided to talk to me about traveling. He was desperate to get out of China, and he really wanted to visit anywhere else in the world, but he couldn't, because it would be very difficult for him to get a visa to leave the country. In his final interview, he told me he wanted to say thank you because he felt I had given him a voice and a place to express himself, which he did not have before in any of his other classes. Then he gave me this bracelet, which is made of tiger's eye. He said that I deserved it because I'm King Little Tiger, and he hugged me. I was a different person when I came back to Canada. I had lost over 100 pounds. I had more confidence. I was excited about life again, and I applied for university with the play I wrote in Qingzhou. I got to reconnect with old friends that I hadn't been able to talk to in a year. It was a remarkably challenging year, but also a transformative one. I still get messages from students asking me when I will come back to China, and I even got one from Aaron a few months after I returned. He said he had the opportunity to study in Brazil. He asked me if he should take it, and of course I said he should. Travel, after all, broadens your horizons. Thank you.